All right, I think we've got it. Let me lead us in prayer. Father, we thank you again for the day, and the day is probably half over for many people in some parts of the world, but again, just thank you, Lord, for your presence here, and just help us to continue to hear you and receive your instruction, receive your direction. Just thank you, Lord, for the work that each of my brothers and sisters are doing in different parts of the world, and we just want to do all things in a way that honors you and just points people to you, I guess, to show them what you're doing in your world. Again, Lord, would ask you today to watch over our technology, let everything work well. I pray, Lord, that you just continue to help each of us, students and us as faculty, continue to make the dissertation process better and better as we just keep thinking and learning and trying to do all things in a way that seems best suited to your purposes. And again, I just thank you, Lord, that you're in charge of all these matters. Please help us today as we go through this session. Teach us what we need to learn. And again, just praise you and thank you for all that you do. And it's in your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen. All right, let's see. Okay. Yeah, Jackie's on the phone, so that's good. All right, we're going to finish out some of those remaining sections of chapter 1. You've been working on your problem statement, your purpose statement, your research questions, some of those essential components for the project. Today, we want to get into definitions, researcher assumptions, and limitations, delimitations. Dr. Henry has a PDF PowerPoint set of slides that she will lead us through. So I think we'll do that here in a minute, and then I will bring up the assignment sheet for this week. I want to possibly change one part of that assignment sheet a little bit. We'll talk that through, though, toward the end of the session. Let me just ask, are there any immediate questions, issues that you would like to bring up before we jump into the content at hand for this week?
Is it possible to have a well-written out dissertation just to be able to learn from something that has been done very well done?
I wish I had one that was meeting our current standards. That's been our problem, because we've been kind of going through a transition over the last 2 years. And so it's a little difficult to come up with a particular dissertation that I feel meets our particular standards right now. I will look, though, and see if there's anything I think maybe would help. And then I may just add a few notes in terms of some of the issues and the sections that we've been trying to refine a bit over this last 1.5 to 2 years, as Dr. Henry and I have been teaching this course together. But yeah, I will take a look and just see if there's anything that maybe fits that situation for us.
Another broad question about how long is usually a dissertation in length? What's the expectation?
Okay, the handbook states 120 pages minimum in the body of the dissertation, not counting the front matter or the back matter, the appendices, etc. So about 120 pages, give or take a few pages. Sometimes if a student has done a lot of original work in the appendix, then we may say, your dissertation may, in the body text, may not be quite as long because you've done a lot of original work within the appendix. But 120 pages is kind of a ballpark figure. A maximum of 150 pages in the body text. If you go over 150 pages, then our technical reader starts charging $5 per page because there's additional reading for her to do and to give recommendations on. So 120 to 150 pages is kind of an average that we're looking for. And the proposal, try to keep up between 45 and 55 pages, okay? Used to have a standard of about 35 pages, but we've kind of expanded some of the sections a little bit. So, 45 to 55 pages. If you go much over 55 pages, then you're pretty much starting to write the dissertation, and just need to caution you, to try to talk concisely and briefly within the proposal, so that you aren't, going on 60, 70, 80 pages, which I've had some students do for a proposal, which really is not an appropriate length for the proposal. So 45 to 55 pages. Let's try to keep the total proposal within that framework. Okay, well, let's jump into the content. If you come up with any other general questions, you can be asking those toward the end of the session. That'll be fine. Why don't you start looking for that PowerPoint, Dr. Henry, and we will start working on that that piece. Any comments you would want to make, Dr. Henry, before you get into that content? I know you've had a few issues on the discussions that you'd like to maybe make.
Yes. I'd just like to make some general observations about the discussions and the quality of the discussions, and just give some guidelines for us going forward. Overall, the quality of the discussion has been good. Some people obviously are doing better work than others, but overall I get a sense that the class understands the process that we are going through, and that is important. One of the things I look at when I review the discussion for grading, of course, is to look at the cross discussion between the students. And some people are very good in that area, and some people are still struggling a little, but I look at that aspect. Now, I just like to make some recommendations going forward with respect to the discussion. The discussion must keep focus around the topic for that week. That is important. And as a result of that, the cross discussion must also stay within the topic of the week. So at this point, some students ask others questions on sample size, research instruments, gaps in the literature. Those are not fair questions because we're not there yet. For example, we're not yet at chapter 2, which is the literature review. And that is the chapter where you will address gaps in the literature. However, in fairness to you and in fairness to the process, at the proposal stage, you may not yet be ready to speak specifically about gaps in the literature because there is so much reading to be done before you can really address that in a meaningful way. Not that you shouldn't attempt to do that, just illustrating that at this point in our discussion, gaps in the literature is not an area that I'm necessarily looking for you to push at. If you're there, that's good. That means that you have done a lot of reading and a lot of relevant reading to the topic on the hand. At this point, there is still a sense of, and that is quite okay, that you are still doing detective work to find the relevant literature that you will be using. So I'm just mentioning that. Questions, I have to say that again. Questions, research questions must be open-ended. Research questions are always open-ended. Research questions are never questions that you can answer with a yes or no response. They must be open-ended. We have talked some about questioning. in fairness to you and in fairness to the process, you could do a whole course on developing research questions. But we have been guiding you, and so far, most people are doing fairly well in that area. But as I said earlier, if your questions are weak, then the whole foundation of your research is going to be weak. That's why we spend a lot of time, and we'll be constantly looking at focusing on your questions. Now, one thing about the questioning process, if for any reason, and we expect that to happen, you shift your focus, your questions will have to shift too. So if you started out with a set of questions that we may have said okay to, yes to, but in the process you're shifting your focus, then you have to go back and revisit those questions. That is just how the process works. And I say that again so that you don't feel frustrated because you have to revise. That's how it goes. And then there is a difference between a major question and a supporting question. And in the discussion that has been coming out, I just want to give some examples of good feedback that has been given to your colleagues in terms of questioning and the kinds of questions that should be asked. In terms of, I noticed that Seagun's study gets a lot of responses, and that's good, that's fine. Last week in the discussion, Hubert made a recommendation to Seagun about a question that he probably should be looking at. And the question he recommended is, what is required for successful entrepreneurial practices in Nigeria? I think that's a good question. And I think Seagun acknowledged that. And then Simon again made a recommendation to Seagun about separating questions. One of the things that happens a lot of times is that you have what we call compound questions. One of the principles about writing a research question is that it must have a clear focus. So you don't do compound questions, as it were. Another issue that has come up, and we're going to be talking about that more when we get into week 7 and we start to look at topics and logical themes. But as part of the process, we have to start thinking about that, and some of you are thinking about it, and that is identifying the key terms of your study so that you could define those key terms. That is important, and the principle about key terms of the study is these are not terms that you make up. These are terms that are supported in the literature. I mean, you will start, and this is relevant as we look at assumptions later. You will start with certain assumptions, and as a result of your underlying assumption, you may have in your mind a key term that your research is going to be focusing on. But what is important is that you have to find the evidence and the support for that in the research literature. And in the process of doing that, what you started out with as a key term may not necessarily be a key term. There may be another term that you will find in the literature, because when you define your terms, you don't make up a definition. You use a definition that is in the literature, right? That is very important. So I'm just reminding, and there's some individuals that I've talked to specifically on that. Let me just stop for any questions or clarification that you may want before I go into the presentation on assumptions, limitations, etc. Any questions or observation that you may want to make as a result of my comments?
So the key terms, I'm assuming, are going to be listed in a very particular part or as an appendix in the dissertation. Do we have to footnote those if these are literature driven? I mean, obviously. I mean,
yes,
if
you always have
something, if it's not something that we're giving our own broad definition, we're going to have to footnote each of those key terms, correct?
Exactly. Several things. One, the definition of terms happens in chapter 1. The key terms I'm talking about is the definition of terms that will be in your chapter 1. And I noticed you said footnote, and that's Turabian, which is fine. With what we use, we talk about referencing, right? Just to remind you of that. The focus is on using APA. Okay, good question. Anybody else?
Let me just make one comment too, and this will probably come out in the presentation, but sometimes I've seen students in the definition sections, they'll put in abbreviations that are being used in the thing, thinking of organizations. Again, that's not really the appropriate use of a definition section. In the dissertation, there'll be an abbreviation section, for example, in the front matter of the dissertation. Again, though, the definitions, as Dr. Henry has just mentioned, they are the key terms. Like if we were just talking about Segan, entrepreneurship would be a key term. And you'd want to define that term from the literature in terms of, because, it could be defined in several different ways. But you would then define that term in the context of what you're doing in your study. Okay, and so you'll think about what are those big conceptual terms. You're going to give a lot more detail on those terminologies probably in the literature review chapter, because they're very possibly going to be a part of your whole theoretical framework. Okay, but in the introduction chapter, you're giving the reader just a brief introduction to some of the key concepts, terms that are contained in your particular project.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Payne. Anybody else? Okay, let's go to the presentation. I'm going to share my screen. This is a PDF, not a PowerPoint. Research assumptions. Okay, sorry. An assumption is a realistic expectation, which is something that we believe to be true. However, no adequate evidence exists to support this belief. In other words, an assumption is an act of faith which does not have empirical evidence to support. The assumption provides a basis to develop theories and research instruments, and therefore influence the development and implementation of the research process. Also, and I'd better move down to that before I make that comment. Definition. Assumptions are statements that are taken for granted or are considered to be true, even though they have not been scientifically tested. They are principles that are accepted as being true based on logic or reason, but without proof or verification. There's a difference between an assumption and a hypothesis. I like to look at it this way. In the beginning process of conceptualizing your research, you will start with an assumption or with a number of assumptions. That's just normal. However, the demand of research is that you test the assumption, and a hypothesis is an assumption that is going to be tested. In addition to which, a hypothesis proposes relationship between variables. So we have these two tables here to illustrate the difference and the relationships between the assumption and the hypothesis. Assumptions are basically beliefs and ideas that we hold to be true. A hypothesis is a prediction. The assumption, often there is little or no evidence that, and so we cannot assume that it has been statistically tested in research. A hypothesis can be statistically tested and may be accepted or rejected. An assumption represents a belief about the variables. A hypothesis is a prediction about the relationship between two or more variables. Assumptions are based on the beliefs the researchers attempt to discover if there is correlation. A hypothesis is a relationship of prediction. It's prediction relation between variables, and it can be statistically tested. So those are the major differences between assumptions and hypothesis. We speak about hypothesis, or we need to attend to hypotheses, especially when we're doing quantitative studies, when we're measuring for variables. With qualitative studies, we do not necessarily begin with a statement of hypothesis. We are more likely to begin a qualitative study with statements of assumptions. However, when we complete a qualitative study, a good conclusion would be to look at the results of your study, and as a result of the study, to propose hypotheses that should be tested in further research in the area that you have covered. So in the quantitative study, we start out with identifying both assumptions and the hypothesis. In the qualitative study, we start out with identifying our assumptions. In the qualitative study, we end up with proposing, as a result of the research, not, you don't pull that out of thin air, but as a result of your research, in a good qualitative study, you may propose hypotheses that should be tested as you move the research further. I stop here so that you could ask questions or say whether or not that makes sense to you.
Dr. Henry, this is Janine.
Yes, Janine.
Yeah, I think you addressed exactly where I was headed, because you're making the distinction between the assumptions and hypothesis. But then when you talked about the qualitative, I was reading more so starting with assumptions, because I changed in my document. I removed hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And I just put the section for assumptions. So
sure.
I think what you're suggesting in terms of how it progresses makes sense, that you start with the assumptions and then eventually you work towards creating the hypothesis, or things that could be tested, I guess, things that would fine tune or solidify maybe what your beliefs are because of the research. Is that what you're saying?
As a result of the research, yes. As a result, and that's important. With a qualitative study, the hypothesis that you will propose, or the hypotheses, must be based on the results of your study.
I see. Okay.
They must be based on the results of your study, whatever those results are.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Sometimes people don't do it in the qualitative study, and that makes for a weaker study, but a good qualitative study Well, in the last chapter where we talk about future research or recommended research that should go forward from your research,
Yeah,
you could raise the testing of hypotheses.
okay. Thank you for that clarification.
Okay. Anybody else?
Let me turn my microphone on. I'm kind of thinking through this issue a little more because, you know, we just kind of added a hypothesis section to our template, you know, a week or two ago. And we, you know, that's not actually been there before. And I want to make sure that we kind of have a, I guess, a distinction here. And I think we're trying to get from this particular table is helpful. In the, we have a section in the introduction chapter called, you know, researcher assumptions or something like that, and worldview. And the intent of that particular section has been to be a place where you, as the writer of that dissertation, can honestly assess even your own biases. You know, Sensing, in the book by Sensing, he makes that point that in writing a dissertation project, the writer needs to be very honest about any biases that he or she may be entering into the project with. Yeah, I was just thinking, yeah, Brian Westfield, you're working on you know, servant leadership in the military. You know, an assumption could be from your worldview, since you've been to BGU, etc., you may think, okay, an assumption may be that servant leadership is a good quality that should be entered into the leadership training of a military program. Now that, I don't know if you're going to try to prove that issue within your dissertation. Are you going to prove that servant leadership is actually something that should be taught? And then where does that should come from? You know, is that could be coming just from your own belief system, thinking that, you know, servant leadership, as a Christian, I believe that's a good form of leadership. You know, others may not agree with you and say, no, that servant leadership really has no place, you know, in a military training program. So again, there again, I'm just using that as an example. An assumption might be that servant leadership is a good thing that should be a part of a military training program. That would become a hypothesis if you're going to actually try to prove that or give some evidence to support your premise that servant leadership would be a helpful component of a military leadership training program. I don't know if that helps or not, but I just kind of thinking of that since I just looked at Brian's work here this morning. And so, you know, something that is a should in your mind could be an assumption, but then you'll have to determine whether you're actually going to make that a hypothesis that you're actually going to test either qualitatively or quantitatively within your particular project.
So are you saying that in the purpose statement, we should address assumed causes and assumed solutions, and then towards the conclusion or the end of the dissertation, we're talking about hypothesized causes and hypothesis solutions, correct?
Yeah, I was just kind of looking at, I've got the template looking at it here. You know, we added hypotheses and quantitative study assumptions. We talked about that last week.
Yeah.
After that, we have a section called researcher assumptions and worldview. And what the template says, you approach every situation with a basic set of assumptions and even biases based on your experiences and worldview. The goal is not necessarily to eliminate your biases, but to indicate how you anticipate any of these issues affecting your work on the project. So, you know, researcher assumptions, at least from my perspective, has always been that section where I try to assess any bias, any particular components of my worldview that could be germane and could somehow affect the way I'm approaching this particular topic. Now there again, whether you're going to take any part of that research or assumption section and actually make it one of the hypotheses that you're going to test within your project. That may or may not be the case. But you need to state that, in, say, in the assumption section. You can say this is an assumption. A very basic assumption for somebody, many BGU is, I approach life from a Christian worldview. That is a particular worldview that you, as the writer of this dissertation, are using. That's a lens that you're making some value judgments that may come out in various parts of the project. Okay, but again, like the table we have here, if one of those assumptions or one of those, even a bias, you want to actually test that with some statistical information, then it would become a hypothesis that you would then also include in that part of the introduction. That's hypotheses and assumptions. So yeah, I mean, making sure that we're using those words, within their context.
Okay, so let's move on.
I would like to ask, are these assumptions, are they the assumptions of the researcher or the general assumption that you found in literature, or are they myths that we find in society?
That's a good question and observation, Kunle. I would recommend that from a research perspective, of course, you have your personal assumptions, but in research, you're always showing that the perspective you bring is not unique to you. You're looking for evidence in the research literature to support your assumption. So yes, you start off with assumptions that are deeply personal, but in a good research, you want to show evidence from the literature that there are others who share your assumption. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Good. I'm glad you raised that. That's a good observation. Okay, we'll continue.
Sorry, if I may ask.
Okay, Sion.
I'm looking at the template as well. And,
yes.
Under the section that Dr. Payne was referring to, it says hypotheses, then in parentheses, quantitative study, or assumptions, in parentheses, qualitative study. So what this portends is that we are going to choose either in our study.
Yes.
All right.
You may do either, or you may do a mixed method study that uses both quantitative and qualitative methodology. That's your choice.
Okay.
Okay?
All right.
Good observation.
Thank you.
Okay. Uses of assumptions in research. Research is built upon assumptions since a foundation is needed to move forward. One must assume something to discover something. Assumptions listed in a research paper may be good sources for the research topics. The assumption provides a basis for the conduct of the research study. Tested assumptions through research studies expand the professional's body of knowledge, and research is about testing assumptions, and in the process of doing that, we expand our knowledge base. Types of assumption, and I'm not going to go into this in depth, but it's speak for itself in terms of the diagram. You have universal assumptions, assumptions based on theories, the assumption that is needed to conduct our research, warranted and unwarranted assumptions. And the presentation gives us examples of these. Going back to the servant leadership theory, which most of you are familiar with, one of the foundational assumptions of servant leadership is that the leader is there to serve first. The leader's interest is service, so that, and here I'm using a little army language, service, so that the subordinates were developed, so that the goal of the leader is not necessarily to lead as much as it is to serve. And that's Greenleaf's definition. He said servant leadership is a way of life which begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first. So at the heart of servant leadership is a leader whose commitment is to service on behalf of others, to serve, to see others grow and develop. Universal assumption. Universal assumptions are beliefs that are assumed to be true by a large part of society, but testing such assumptions is not always possible. For example, there's a supernatural power which governs this universe. That is a universal assumption, but it's not easy to prove the existence of God. Then there are assumptions based on theories, and I just mentioned servant leadership as an example. Assumptions may also be drawn from theories. If a research study is based on a theory, the assumption of the particular theory may become an assumption of that particular research study. And he gives an example here. A study on Roy's adaptation model will use an assumption of that particular theoretical model. The assumptions that are needed to conduct a research. Some of the common sense assumptions may be developed to conduct a particular study. For example, and this is from the health field, the prevalence of coronary artery disease is more common among urban people as compared to rural people. And one of the reasons for that in the medical world has to do with the difference in diet between urban and rural people, especially in the context in which this is done in India. Warranted assumptions. These are stated along with evidence to support them. For example, regular prayers bring success because they boost morale. And then you have what we call unwarranted assumptions. These are stated without any supportive evidence. For example, Almighty God exists everywhere in this universe. And that is debatable depending on a person's religious orientation. Examples of assumptions. He gave some others. Williams reviewed published nursing studies and other healthcare literature where the following common assumptions were found. People are aware of the experiences that most affect their life choices. People in underserved areas, and I thought about Julia as I read this one, feel underserved. People want to assume control of their own health problems. Stress should be avoided. Health is the priority of most people. Most measurable attitudes are held strongly enough to direct behavior. Health professionals view healthcare in a different manner than a layperson. Human biological and chemical factors show less variation than cultural and social factors. The nursing process is the best way to conceptualizing nursing practices. And statistically significant differences relate to the variables under consideration. And we have some more examples that I'll just scroll through. This is going to be put into the course so you can review. Limitations. Limitations are restrictions. Sorry.
Let me just make one more comment just
Sure.
before we leave assumptions.
Go ahead, Dr. Payne.
And I'm even thinking possibly we shouldn't even use the word assumptions when we are talking in the hypotheses section. Because I guess what I want to just make very clear here, and it's come out again as we just looked at examples of some of these, quote, assumptions that would say be put in a research assumption section. And I'm looking at sensing here too. He says, what's your place of beginning? What things are necessary to your study that you will assume, which you will not set out to prove? I'm thinking that's probably a distinction that we need to be making, is that in this research assumption section, these particular statements that we've just looked at were somewhat common knowledge within the medical profession that did not need to be proven, say, within a particular dissertation. So I'm thinking that's what, when we're talking about research assumptions, we're talking about issues that you do not need to necessarily prove, but they are, for you, they are the common knowledge as you're approaching a particular topic. Whereas the sections called hypotheses, and I may come up with a different word than assumptions for the qualitative, are specific statements, premises that you are going to address within the context of your particular project. So I hope we can kind of keep that distinction in our mind as we're thinking about assumptions.
Okay. Limitations. Limitations are restrictions of the study due to theoretical or methodological reasons, which may decrease the credibility and generalizability of the research findings. Usually there are two types of limitations in research studies, which may reduce, that's a repetition, and the two are the theoretical limitations and the methodological limitation. The theoretical limitation, they restrict the ability of research findings to generalize due to the use of specific theoretical concepts in the study, or limiting the study of variables through operational definitions. Let me just clarify that phrase, operational definition. You're going to see it in the research literature. When we talk about an operational definition, we're talking about a definition that can be measured. And so going back to the theory of servant leadership, one of the criticisms that have been made about the theory of servant leadership is that, to begin with, there is no one common definition that everybody agrees on in terms of the meaning of servant leadership. The work of Greenleaf has popularized the concept of servant leadership, but Greenleaf himself was not proposing a theory of servant leadership. His work is basically a philosophy of servant leadership, a rationale for servant leadership. Now, other persons have taken his work and developed it in such a way that they could measure for servant leadership. And we have several researchers who have done that. One of them is Dierendonk. His name, I never pronounce it right, but he identifies what he calls 6 characteristics of servant leadership. And as a result of that, he has developed an instrument that has been widely used to measure for the presence of servant leadership in organizations. And the 6 characteristics that he has listed in terms of servant leadership are empowering and developing people, humility, authenticity, interpersonal acceptance, providing direction, and stewardship. And so the instrument that he produced measures for the presence of these characteristics when looking at an organization to see if the leadership in the organization exemplifies servant leadership. Just to explain, by way of example, the importance of the theoretical piece in terms of assumptions, hypotheses, etc. Methodological limitations, it has to do with the method of the study. Now, going back to the foundational things that we have been looking at and working at, I've mentioned, and we've mentioned over and over again, the importance of good questions of the study. So you find that it takes time for you to come up with questions that are meaningful enough to do a research study on, because that's foundational. Because as a result of the questions of the study, you will move now to the place where looking at the literature, looking to find supportive literature, or looking at what may be gaps in the literature, you now move towards the method that you're going to use to study the issue of interest. And the method, there's a sense in which the method may impact the results of the study. But what is even more important is that the method must be logical and acceptable within the research field. So that is why it's important, and chapter 3 of a research report is very critical, because you have to be able to justify and to explain and to give evidence to show that the method that you're using is about the best way to study the issue that you want to address. And if that is not well done, your research could be cited as weak. So that is why you have to be transparent about the method that you use. And that is where the issue of the sample that you choose, the participants, how they're chosen, the instruments that you're going to use to test or to measure for the variables, all of that comes up in chapter 3, and it's important that chapter 3 be well written. So methodological limitations usually result from some of the methodological factors, such as if you have an unrepresentative sample, if you have a weak design, a single setting, limited control over extraneous variables, poor data collection procedure, ineffective use of statistical analyses. Any of these can skew your research in such a way that it's not accepted as valid. So it is important that when you select a sample that you're going to use, that sample be representative. Now, if the sample is not representative, then you have to say that. And if the sample is not representative, then you're not able to say that your study applies to a given group. It is just valid for that group that was on the study. A weak design, limited control over extraneous variables, those are some weaknesses that need to be understood and addressed. So chapter 3 is very critical, and chapter 3 takes a lot of time to think through and to write up so that you are not weak in that area. Now, much of what we report in research requires that we be transparent, we be honest, we be open. So researchers usually mention limitations of their studies so that the reader can have an idea about the credibility and generalizability of the study. one of the characteristics that mark good research or valuable research is that we want to be able to generalize from a particular research to the rest of the population. But that is not always possible. And if your findings cannot be generalized, it doesn't mean that your research doesn't have weight or doesn't have validity. But what you have to be able to say is, if it is generalizable, you have to be able to say why the findings could be generalized. And if it is not, you just say, well, these findings are this is what I found, but it is linked to the sample on the study. We can't take the results and apply it in any other setting. And then we have some examples here to help us to understand the limitations. The study effectiveness of planned teaching on the knowledge of staff nurses working in a psychiatric unit regarding physical restraints for psychiatric patient in selected hospital of the Vidarbha region, that is India. The study is delimited only to the nurses working in the units of the general and specific hospital of that region. The study is limited to the population that speaks English. The study is limited to registered and licensed nurses. The study is limited to nurses with GNM and BSc nursing education. And the study is limited to the experience level of the researcher. So the researcher has clearly given a description of the limits of his or her study. And that is what is required of you as a researcher, that you yourself must be able to identify the limitations. If you don't, others will look at your study and they will be able to identify the limitations. So in your defense, one of the questions that is asked or should be asked is, what are the limitations of your study? Because it's important that you yourself can identify the limitations, and then the reviewers may, depending on how well you answer that question, the reviewers may say, but do you notice that this issue is a limitation? You shouldn't have to have that happen to you. You should be able to identify all the limitations of your study. And that brings us to the end of this presentation. Okay, question, comment? We will put this up.
Let me make one other comment about what you were just saying there, Dr. Henry. At the proposal stage, I would say that a student is going to needs to think through the limitations and the delimitations. It may be, though, that you're not going to be aware of all the limitations until you actually get into the research.
Sure.
I remember one woman, she was working in the veterinary field, did a dissertation, and she was going to be able to go into a school and survey, a lot of the people and get some opinions on some important issues. As she got into the research, though, then the school administration would not allow her to do what she thought she was going to be able to do, which therefore she then had to revise her research methodology a bit and state in the limitations section of her dissertation, this is what happened and this is how it has limited my study. So at the proposal stage, we want you to think through what are some of the possible limitations. And the delimitations, delimitations is the way you are going to intentionally limit a particular issue. Limitations are limits that are imposed upon you from the situation. So at the proposal stage, you think through those, but you may not be aware of all those limitations until you actually get into the research, and that's fine. At the proposal stage, we just want to make sure, we want to see that you have thought through at least what are some of the possible limitations, delimitations in your particular study.
Thank you, Dr. Payne. Questions, comments before I hand back over to Dr. Payne?
Dr. Henry, could you please
Yes.
restate the operational definition? I missed that.
The operational definition
The
is one
definition.
that you can measure.
Okay.
It's stated in such a way, and I gave an example from servant leadership.
Yeah.
So your definition is what you are going to measure in the study.
Okay.
That's why it's called an operational definition.
Thank you.
Good question. Anybody else? Okay, I will stop sharing my screen. And I'll let Dr. Payne conclude. Dr. Payne, you need to unmute.
Yes, sorry, thank you. Yeah, I want to just mention too, and I just saw a couple of comments in terms of still confusion on assumptions and hypotheses. And I understand that there's going to be some confusion on that. And some of that confusion even is, you know, every time I look at the template that we use at VGU, every term, it seems like I find something else that I want to kind of refine the wording a little bit. And so I'm thinking the term assumptions, when we put it in the section called hypotheses or assumptions, could be a little confusing. I'm trying to think of a better word for assumptions for the qualitative study. It's kind of though the beginning point, the beginning premise that you have, not necessarily thinking of your biases or what you just take for granted that you'll talk about in the research or assumptions section. But they are going to be in the hypotheses / assumptions or whatever we're going to use. Those are, I'm going to use the word a premise, a thesis, a hypothesis. It is something that you are coming into the study to prove, find evidence for, to determine in some way, okay? That's different than what you're doing in the research or assumption section, which are things that you're just sort of taking for granted. They're just part of your worldview. And so you probably just have to kind of do some writing in both of those sections, and hopefully maybe that'll start to become clear, and you know, and we can make comments, you know, based on what you write, to see if we can help firm up that distinction even a little more, even in the template.
But then if we're using premise or basis, it's only when it is a qualitative study.
Well, yeah, you know, the word premise, you know, usually is kind of a beginning point. We tend to use the word hypothesis if it's a quantitative study. Again, we're just kind of wrestling with words here a little bit, okay? The hypothesis, it's used as a tentative premise, okay? But it's going to be addressed through some statistical analysis within the study. You're going to collect information from people to begin to determine whether or not your hypothesis is correct or not. Even as I said in the template, technically in a qualitative approach, say you're going into an interview, you try to go in without a lot of assumptions, really, okay? Because the idea for a qualitative study is that information, they call them themes, start to emerge from your talking with someone, okay? And you try to not assume, okay? Because, you know, your assumptions may get in the way of trying to allow certain themes to come forth in a qualitative interview. So again, you know, we're dealing with words here, but I think, you know, the hypothesis, that word is used more for a quantitative study where you actually are going in with a formal hypothesis that you're going to test through your, you know, through your statistical information that you gather. Qualitative studies, you go in somewhat without real formal assumptions or without a formal hypothesis. And the idea, as you are looking, you're talking with people, you start to hear certain topics come forth, okay? I use, in some of the instructional sheets I use a study on gang violence that was done in Seattle by one of our students at one time. And, as an interviewer sat down with, say, gang members, they would hear a gang member say, why did you join a gang? Well, I felt the need for protection. Somebody else, they talked to, why did you join a gang? Well, I felt very vulnerable just out there on the streets without anyone that I was close to. Someone else says, I joined a gang because there's safety in numbers. Okay. Well, all three of those statements, there's a theme, right? A person joined a gang for protection in some way. Okay. So in a qualitative study, I may be interviewing gang members and I begin to see certain topics or themes arise. Now I can start to form one part of a hypothesis. Some people join gangs for protection, okay? But I found that out as I was listening to people talk about their experience or why they joined that gang, okay? So that's the whole idea, and we'll talk more about themes and grounded theory when we actually get into the research methodology. But I guess just kind of keep it in your mind that in the hypothesis section, you're kind of, especially at a quantitative level, you're putting forth ideas, thoughts, something that you want to prove. You want to try to find evidence for. You may or may not totally prove it in your project, but you are looking for evidence to support your thinking on what causes a particular situation or what might be a solution to a particular situation. Whereas in the qualitative section, you may have some notions about why such and such is true, but you try to go into the situation trying to clear your mind and just really listening to people to see what topics are coming forth as I ask certain questions. Again, I understand still it's a little vague. Hopefully, as you keep working with this, you'll see some distinctions there. One of the issues I'll say, and it really struck me as we go through some of these topics, we really, in higher education, at the doctoral level especially, we are trying to promote what we call critical thinking. And one part of critical thinking is thinking about why you think the way you think. Okay, it's a self-analysis. So when we talk about the researcher assumptions, you're thinking very critically about your own worldview, your own the way you perceive the environment around you, how your particular family background, your cultural background, whatever it happens to be, has affected the way you look at reality, the way you look at life, right? That's all part of your researcher assumptions or things that you take for granted, so to speak. That's a little different than when you're, say, trying to think of hypotheses or specific premises that you are going to utilize, that you're going to test or find evidence to support or disprove through your particular research methodology. All right. Let me just bring up one other. I hope I still have it here. Okay, yeah, let me share my screen for a moment.
I think one thing that might be helpful for future classes is if the presentation we just had on the hypotheses was given like last week when we actually discuss or break it out more clearly. You see what I'm saying? Because our mindset is according to the lecture last week, and this week it's a whole new dimension to that.
Right.
And if it was a little more streamlined in how it's presented, that might give less confusion.
I agree. I've been trying to think where that section on research assumptions really belongs, okay? I mean, I've read dissertations that don't even include that, Sensing includes it in his, and I've seen it in a lot of dissertations, that the researcher needs to have a place where he or she is giving some thought to his or her own biases, her own, what he or she takes for common knowledge, etc. But where to place that, I'm not sure. It maybe should even go before we are talking about research questions and hypotheses, okay? It's just kind of a general introduction to the way you as a researcher are coming into a particular study and your particular worldview. So yeah, where that fits, I'm still wrestling with that a little bit myself, which would then affect where we cover it, even say in our class discussions. Let me share my screen one moment here. This is the instruction sheet for this week, and I emailed Dr. Henry on an issue just before we started this class because I had another little brainstorm that I'm kind of thinking about in terms of the template. Right now, actually, let me bring up the template for a moment. Right now, the template, we start out with the, okay, we're in the statement of the purpose, intent, which is kind of an introduction, what your goal and how you're going to start to meet that goal. We have research questions. We've talked about that. And then we talked last week a bit about this hypotheses, and still thinking about this word assumptions, okay? But hypotheses are educated guesses about possible causes and solutions to a problem, okay? And then we kind of distinguish between a quantitative study and a qualitative study. After that section, we've had a section in the template, and this template has gone through several evolutions over the last few years. We have this section called transformational significance of the project. And the more I've thought about that, I'm not even sure that's really a good place to put that. When we're back here at the problem statement, one of the issues we ask at the end of the problem statement is, let's see, where did I say it? Okay, conclude this section with an indication of the goal of your project and the significance or the uniqueness of this project considering other previous projects and studies. And I'm going to talk this through a little more with Dr. Henry, but I'm thinking when we're thinking about the significance of this project, a common denominator for all BGU projects is that there's going to be some transformational significance, okay? That may be a major, it may not be quite so major, depending on what the issue is. But I'm thinking that might be the best place to just say a few words about the significance of your project in terms of what kinds of transformations you are hoping it will help bring about. I'm thinking in terms of this section called the transformational significance, we've always had a place, and it states right here, also briefly describe how you anticipate the project demonstrating the transformational leadership principles, such as the 8 perspectives taught at BGU. We've always had that here in the introduction chapter, but I'm thinking if you as a student, and I'm welcome your feedback on this issue, you can kind of help us think through this issue. If you just give a brief statement on the transformational significance of your project as you see at this point, at the end of your problem statement, when you talk about the significance of the project, then I'm thinking possibly in the literature review, since all BGU projects have to contain some level of transformation, and we want you to understand that. We have our 8 perspectives, eight transformational leader perspectives that are included in every syllabus of a class. I'm thinking it might be more appropriate to talk about these, one or more of these transformational leadership perspectives within the literature review, because from a BGU perspective, that transformational leadership theory is going to be a component for every BGU dissertation. So I'm thinking it might be the appropriate place where you can talk, a little more in depth would be in the literature review chapter to devote a section to some part of the transformational leadership theory that will be very appropriate, applicable to your particular project. Having said all that, at this point, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and not include this transformational significance section in your work this week. I think we want to think about where that actually belongs. So for this week, I want you to really, wrestle with this whole issue of definitions. Dr. Henry has given you some content on definitions. Work with delimitations and limitations. And let's see. Okay, somehow this should have said researcher assumptions. I'm not sure what happened to this instruction sheet. But anyway, this would be, we just take that out of there. Yeah, okay, so this would be, and this is just my copy, so I'm just doing this for my notes. Researcher assumptions, writing about research biases and assumptions, Miriam Tisto state that the researcher needs to make explicit the assumptions with which they come to the study. What are your biases? What should we know about you, the researcher, etc. Again, that's what this whole thing called researcher assumptions, maybe call it researcher biases. It's kind of that beginning place that you are as you come to work in this particular project. Things that maybe you take for common knowledge, your worldview, whatever happens that be. It's kind of that basic set of values, principles, even biases that you hold dear that cause you to be who you are and could affect how you are approaching this particular project. Okay, so we've got researcher assumptions, we've got definitions of terms, and then we've got the delimitation and limitation section. I'm thinking if you will just devote your time to those three sections this week, that will be enough. Don't worry about this transformational significance of the project, because I'm thinking I may want to move that section and not really deal with it in this particular part of the template. That makes sense? Okay. I have 15 minutes past the hour, so we've been working for about an hour and 15 minutes. I really would like to kind of hold our time to that time limit. Again, this session has been recorded. I'm always open to ideas and thoughts, even as, and thank you, Susan, for your comment. Even the order that we present things, we always want to have feedback on how content we present. If it creates confusion, if there's a better order or sequence to present things, we as faculty members always want to be listening and working to always improve the way we present content so that it's the best way so that it's received. There's a proverb I always like to quote. It's in the New American Standard in NSAB version. It says, Proverbs 15:1 says, wisdom makes knowledge acceptable. Wisdom makes knowledge acceptable. And I've often thought about that, even as we look at the world we live in. Many people have a lot of knowledge, but they don't always have the wisdom to know how to put it across so that it gets received, okay? And so I think even as we as faculty, we are continually looking for wisdom on how to best present content, knowledge, so that it can be absorbed and received and put to good use. With that, I think we're going to close unless there's any other last minute comments that need to be stated. All right. I so appreciate you all and even your willingness to work through some of these issues as we continue to try to make our own BGU dissertations better and better. Okay. So work at it this week, and you'll get feedback in the discussion area, and then I'll give you more feedback in the written assignment. And I'm starting to work on your problem statement and your purpose statement. I've done a few of those, but I will get that back to you over the next couple of days. All right, thank you. You can check out the recording. I will get that link out to you here in a little bit.
Thank you, and have a good week, everybody.
Thank you.
Goodbye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.